Hi everyone. Every now and then I come across some seriously mysterious stories that just seem unexplainable. I've put 4 together here in a different format of a video, slightly shorter in length. Let me know if you like this kind of thing, and we can make it a regular fixture. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Thanks for watching. I'm typing this on my phone, so sorry for the grammar or any mistakes, and for the length. I know that most other stories posted here are longer, so I don't know, sorry, I just wanted to share mine. I say it's mine, but that isn't strictly true. I heard about this from a friend who doesn't have any interest in sharing stories online, so I'll do it for her. My friend's a nurse, and this happened when she was working at a certain general hospital, and in this certain hospital, there was an open secret among the staff. Unpleasant things was how some described it. Some said paranormal activity, and others just plain didn't like to talk about it. Most of the alleged activity happened during the night shift. It was somehow common that nurses would get calls from empty rooms. It was as if someone unseen was pressing the nurse call button next to an unoccupied bed. Because of this strange phenomenon, the nurses asked and were granted to walk the wards in pairs on the night shift. So this is my friend's experience of what happened when she was working the night shift and she was doing her rounds of the wards with a colleague. They got to a room that they knew was unoccupied, but since they were called, they were duty-bound to go in and check it out. They arrived at the empty room, and before they walked into the room, they knew they would find it empty, and they were right. They scanned the room, as was the rules, and it was only when they were about to turn to leave that my friend noticed something that was certainly out of place. She looked down towards the floor for some reason, and that was where she spotted something. It was just sticking out below the curtain. The curtains were attached to rails that ran along the ceiling, the type that could be pulled to separate space for patients, a sort of room divider, if you will. There, just creeping under the curtain and in the gap between the floor and the bottom of the curtain, appeared to be a hand. It grasped and searched for something. My friend said that the hand was brownish in color. It looked unwell. The 2 nurses had just looked over every inch of the room, and there was no one in there. They were seeing something that their eyes couldn't believe and their minds could not explain. My friend isn't the squeamish type. I mean, what nurse is? She kept her cool and simply pointed out the disembodied hand to our colleague. And they both quickly and calmly exited the unoccupied room. They went back to the nurse's station, and her colleague, who, by the way, was her senior in every sense of the word, at work and in age, told her not to worry about what she had just seen. What did she mean, don't worry? Who couldn't worry about seeing something as strange as that? Apparently, the way her senior told her not to worry made it sound like that was the end of the conversation. But my friend, she pressed her colleague for an explanation of what they had just seen, and reluctantly her colleague said that earth-colored hands were likely signs of organ failure. Did they see some kind of manifestation from a previous patient? It gives me the chills to imagine what they saw. That grasping hand might have belonged to a patient who fell out of bed and was trying to get the attention of the nurses in their final moments. The strangest and creepiest thing that has ever happened to me in my life happened when I was back in my hometown to visit my parents last summer. I met up with some of my friends from school and spent some good time with my parents, but after a couple of days I ended up sat on the veranda with nothing much to do. I grew up in the countryside, and nowadays I live in a big city, so it was really nice to come back and take in a bit of nature. Summers are always really pleasant in my hometown. That afternoon there was a gentle breeze that swept through the rice fields, that our veranda looks out onto. The cicadas were chirping in the distance, and I was thinking of how we really didn't hear much of them in the city. Just for some context, my parents' home is in Fukushima Prefecture. It's such a rural place that sometimes we can see wild bears from the window. It's a really peaceful place. I laid there on the deck chair and I shut my eyes. The warm sunlight felt nice against my eyelids. I was really relaxing. So what happened next was inevitable. I fell asleep. I woke up after an unknown period with this dreamy, exact thought in my mind. What's this? Something feels ticklish. I first thought that it might be a bug, and I hate bugs, so I opened my eyes. I was so shocked by what I saw. An old woman I had never seen before was sat right next to me. She was rubbing my arm. She looked to be in her 70s or 80s, and she was wearing a really dirty-looking, tattered kimono. So dirty that I couldn't make out what the original color was supposed to be. She was looking downwards at my arm, so I couldn't make out her face. I thought, "What the heck are you doing? Stop it!" or something to that effect. It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe that this total stranger had entered our property to rub my skin while I slept. I felt gross and frightened, to be honest, and those two feelings after waking up are very hard to process. With that in mind, you might understand my next actions. I was groggy. As my brain began to get itself into gear, I knew that I needed to get this woman off of me. I went to shout at her to get off, but I found that I couldn't coax the words out of my throat. I was unable to speak. All I heard myself produce was a very hoarse, wordless groan. Moreover, I found that I couldn't move my body. I couldn't shove her away. It was like my brainwaves weren't reaching my limbs. It hadn't ever happened before or since. Next, I heard the strange old woman speak, and the phrase she kept repeating has constantly creeped me out whenever I remember it. "I love slimy things, especially when it's young skin." It didn't make sense, but she kept on repeating it. "I love slimy things, especially when it's young skin." "Get off me, you hag," I wanted to scream, but the words still wouldn't come out. My arms and legs still continued to disobey me too. I was straining as hard as I could to get away from her, so much so that I felt sweat begin to gather on my forehead. She muttered something about how young skin was irresistible when it's slimy again. I couldn't do anything about her. I hated and was disgusted by what was happening. The old woman then began to turn her head and attention away from my arm. She slowly raised her head to meet my gaze, while raising an arm slowly towards my face. That was the moment that I got a look at her face. I can still see it in my mind sometimes, usually whenever I'm in a dark place or something. Her face was so swollen that all of the features on her face were barely distinguishable. Her eyes were almost closed. They seemed to be enveloping her nose too. She was spewing a mixture of blood and foam from her mouth down onto my arm. I couldn't handle it anymore. I don't know what happened, but I'm assuming that I fainted. It was like my brain went to safe mode. The next thing I knew, I woke up. It was already dark outside, and I was still out on the veranda. My parents were saying something. The first thing I felt was a burning sensation, an intense feeling of pain. I figured out that my parents were saying stuff like, "What's happened to you?" It was all very alarming. I didn't even think about the old woman at that point. All I could focus on was the pain. I looked down towards the area of my pain, my arm, and I saw that my skin had been peeled away. My arm was covered in blood. There was no sign of the old woman, but she definitely left with a part of me. I have no explanation for what happened that summer afternoon. I know that is something that people often say when they feel as if something very strange has happened. But honestly, I mean it. I cannot understand what happened to me that afternoon. I don't know if that old woman was real, or if it was some kind of hallucination or something more sinister. I have been back to my parents' house since, but I do not go anywhere near the veranda anymore. Oh, and by the way, I got myself fixed up at the hospital. I told them that I wanted antibiotics. I hope that it was just a hallucination. But even if it was, how did my skin get peeled off? Why was my arm all slick and slimy with blood and it turns my stomach to even think this, but saliva. Like I said, it was the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, and I pray that I never see that old hag again. Every night for the past 2 months, between the hours of 2 and 3 a.m., I've been hearing this weird sound. It sounds like someone is pedaling a really old bicycle around my house. There is a road really close by my house, and I live on a corner, so we do hear traffic coming and going, but it's quite rare, since I live in the middle of nowhere. Because it happens so often, I got more and more curious. I got up one night when I heard the sound of that old bicycle coming, and I tried to see if I could see it from my window. Even though I could clearly hear the sound and my ears were telling me it was right out there, right in front of my window, I couldn't see it. As the nights went by, I managed to create a picture in my mind of the route that the bicycle was taking. It seemed to approach from distance on the left, turn the corner, go down the right side of my house, and then I can't hear it at that point, but I hear it again after a couple of minutes, approach again from distance on the left. This weird loop or circle goes on for roughly an hour. It's the strangest thing. It had been going on for a while, and because I couldn't see what was causing the sound, I began to worry about my own state of mind. I wondered if I was hearing things. Maybe I was under some kind of stress that I wasn't aware of. So I invited one of my best friends over. I told him about the sound of the old bicycle, and I felt so stupid to be sharing it. It sounded like I was mad when I was saying it out loud. Thankfully, my friend didn't make fun of me. He listened, and he was very interested in finding out the source of the sound. He suggested that we wait for the sound to approach, and when it comes close enough, let's try and get in front of it to see what happens. I was interested, but I think the beers we had been having had given me some extra confidence. I wanted an end to that noise. It was very irritating. I just didn't understand how something unseen could be making that noise. So I wanted to see for myself, and having my friend with me was the final push I needed. The one thing I wasn't so sure of was standing in the way of the source of the sound. I didn't think that would be a good idea, but my friend wanted to do it. We waited until 2 a.m. I hoped that the noise was going to come like normal at points, because otherwise I would have sounded a little crazy. I almost thought that it wasn't going to come. But then, just after 2 a.m., it approached. We left my home and went out into the dark night. The crickets were chirping and there was a little breeze blowing through the trees. We stood there listening to the old bicycle sound approaching, but seeing nothing on the road. After a few moments, it passed right in front of us, and then it went down the right-hand side of my house and out of earshot, just like always. My friend was amazed by what he had heard, and I was happy that I wasn't losing my mind. When that noise went down past my house, to the right and away, he asked me what would happen next, so I told him that the noise would be back soon, coming from the left. He then took a couple of strides out into the middle of the road and stood there smiling at me with his hands on his hips as if to say, "I'm not moving." He stood there waiting, and I didn't feel like standing next to him. There was some part of me that said, "Stay away from it." I'm glad I listened to that part of me. A few moments passed and the bicycle began to approach from the left again. It slowly approached as usual, and the tension I felt escalated more and more as it gradually got to the place where my friend stood. The moment that it reached the spot where he was stood, the sound suddenly disappeared. We were both amazed. I was so glad that it was gone. Now I could sleep through the night. We both went back inside, relieved, and went to bed. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't really care. It was gone now. 3 days later, I heard some sad news. My friend was hit by a car. He broke his right arm and his right leg. It was a serious injury, but not a life-ending one. I visited my friend in the hospital, and he said that when the car approached, he was crossing the road. He had enough time to cross the road, but when he got to the middle of the road, he said it felt like his body turned to stone. He couldn't move. All he could do was watch as the car plowed into him. I don't know if him stood in front of the noise that old bicycle was making had something to do with what put him in the hospital. But he's doing better now, and he's out of the hospital. Months have passed since that night he stayed over. One thing is, though, the noise has come back. It's driving me mad. I can't sleep. It's all I can think about. Last night I went out into the road to see if I could put a stop to the noise, just to get some sleep, just like my friend did. And the same thing happened to me. The noise stopped where it reached the spot where I was stood. Everything's fine now. It's back to being nice and quiet near my place. Shortly after I entered high school, my mother disappeared. After school, my dad sat me down and told me in a very serious tone about what had happened. He said that my mum had been having an affair. She had had a boyfriend that none of us knew about for several years apparently. I remember the moment where I felt my heart sink. It was when my dad said, "She has abandoned me and you." He hung his head low after he said that. And it's a moment that my mind keeps replaying from time to time. I decided in that moment that I would make efforts to show him how much he meant to me, to cherish him as much as I had cherished my mother. Strange goings-on began to happen at home after that day. I can't say all of them are unexplainable because a house suddenly without a mother to a high school girl would certainly take some adjusting to. But there were some things going on for sure. We kept finding hair everywhere, long black hair. I had short, dyed brown hair at the time, so it wasn't mine, and my dad didn't have long hair. It was weird. As well as the hair, we noticed that doors, which we were certain we had closed, were opened, and things around the house went missing. My dad said he was concerned that Mum was getting in and getting out of the house while we were out. But I didn't agree. I don't know why, but my first thought was something closer to, is Mum dead? I guess it was because all that was happening in our home felt a little closer to paranormal activity than random break-ins. I kept thinking about it all. Not many days had passed at this point from the time that my dad told me that my mum had left. Then, one day something clicked, and it was the sight of shoes that did it. All of my mother's shoes were right by the door, where she had left them. Surely if my mum did plan on running away from her family, she would have left wearing shoes. Why were they all still here? My mind then produced a strange and frightening thought. If everything's still here, then does that mean that my mum was killed in this house? Why? What happened? I had lots of thoughts and emotions to process. Of course I doubted my theory, but I couldn't seem to pick holes in it. And my gut didn't doubt it all that much. It niggled me. It ate away at me. I felt the urge to question my father, but then I went against it. I had already lost my mother. If I got my father arrested, then who would take care of me? I'd have no parents. And I knew that my dad loved my mum. I don't know if he could have done that to her. If I was wrong about my theory, then I don't know how I could look my dad in the eye again. After accusing him of something like that, I would have lost all of his trust. So I carried on like normal, despite my strong gut feeling. However, all the strange goings-on at home continued. I woke up in the middle of the night at the sound of footsteps. I knew that they weren't my father's footsteps, I could just tell. I was really frightened. I lay there in bed thinking, please don't come to my room. I pulled the covers and tightened them over my head. The covers couldn't drown out the sound of footsteps approaching though. Despite my wishes, they had entered my bedroom. I really hoped my dad wasn't right about intruders. I heard the footsteps stop at the side of my bed, and I felt a presence come close to my cheek. I opened my eyes. I didn't want to, but I had to see the threat if I stood any chance of escaping it. I opened my eyes to see my mother stood by the side of my bed. She looked at me in the eyes and said 2 words. "Get out." I was terrified. I screwed my eyes shut and turned on my side. After a few seconds, I couldn't fight the urge to keep my eyes shut, so I opened them and I looked for my mother, but she was gone. I asked myself if she was ever really there. Maybe she had been there, as an apparition, but not in her physical form. I know it wasn't her in person, and my theory about my father then began to gather weight. I couldn't live in that house, and I had to move out, but I knew I wouldn't be able to tell my father why I was moving, and on top of that, I wasn't anywhere near old enough to be living alone. I seemed to be the only one in the house who had an encounter at home, though. He was moving on as if nothing had happened. Ever since my mum went missing, my father switched to working at home. He was doing all the chores and trying to give me the best upbringing I could have hoped for. When I sat with him to have dinner, could I really say or even think, "Dad, are you a killer?" I could do little more than pretend that nothing was happening. I fell asleep on the sofa one afternoon, and I woke up to feel an intense pain in my little toe. I looked in the direction of the pain and saw my mother stood there again. She raised an arm and pointed to an old school bag of mine. I screamed a little. My dad, who was busy cooking in the kitchen, shouted out at me, asking what was wrong. I quickly replied with a lie. "Oh, nothing, Dad. I just remembered I have to do some homework." "Well, you better do it in the living room because dinner's almost ready," he replied. I looked over towards the bag that she had pointed at, and I wondered what the significance of it might be. I got up and went over to it. It was the bag I used when I was a junior. I hadn't really used it since Mum disappeared. Maybe that was why she was trying to make me aware of it. I got the bag, and I started going through it. There wasn't anything in the main compartment of the bag, so I opened up one of the side pockets to see what was in there, and I found something. I found a small folded note in there. It had been folded into quarters, and it had been stuffed right at the bottom. I unfolded the note, and I instantly recognized the handwriting. It was my mother's. The note said, "Run away. Dad's crazy." I realized that my mum had been trying to tell me to escape. Hi, Jay here. This is frustratingly where the writer leaves her story. Let's hope that if everything is true, and she was living with a killer, she escaped. I'm guessing that the reason she didn't continue to share was perhaps due to the difficult feelings she would have had going through the processes that followed.